like tears in rain.
Welcome to another episode of Wheel of Horror Sci-Fi Summer, the podcast where two best friends spin a wheel once a week, it chooses the sci-fi movie, and they discuss it. Today we're talking about the 1982 film Blade Runner, which was directed by Ridley Scott. I'm your co-host Alec, and Erik is actually on a little vacation, so I thought why not have the most knowledgeable guest we have, Joe Testa, filling in.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very sweet.
No, dude, seriously, it's so funny. We were talking about before, like, this is turning into, like, the Joe show, because we had you for, like, Friday the 13th. I know what you did last summer.
Yep.
And then this all within a month, which I love because I'm learning so much.
Well, it's always a good time. Thank you again for having me.
Yeah, man. And this movie is one of my all-time favorites, and I know you're a big fan too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I'm always curious when I meet a big fan of this movie, like how you became a big fan, because I feel like it was a journey, to become a
Mm.
big fan of this movie. So I'm just interested in what that journey was like for you.
Yeah, man. It was like I feel like I was like 10 or 11 or 12, like right around that time. My dad showed it to me. And I remember not really liking it that much when I was young. I was like, it's kind of boring. I liked Harrison Ford, obviously, because I loved Indiana Jones and Star Wars, but it wasn't something that I was like, it grabbed my attention that much. And then I bought the DVD when I was probably like 16, watched it again, liked it, but again, didn't grip me. And then in my 20s, I just really started getting into it again. And then this sequel came out and it just completely reinvigorated my interest in it. So that's kind of my watered down journey, I guess. What about you?
Wow. I think everybody has a very similar journey with this movie, or maybe just certain people our age. I feel like we all come to it with certain expectations,
Hmm.
and we're usually a little disappointed. I'll tell you how I came to it. I feel like it's one that I passed on video store shelves. It has that great box art, that great
Hmm.
poster art, but it was never one that I caught on TV. It wasn't one of those sci-fi action movies that we all saw on TV growing up, like Predator or Terminator. But I'll tell you, the first time I thought to myself, well, I'm going to put that one on my list. I remember I was reading a review, I think in like Entertainment Weekly, of The Crow. And I'm a huge fan of that movie.
Yeah.
And they mentioned that it was like the best movie of its kind since Tim Burton's Batman and Ridley Scott's Blade Runner.
Hmm.
And of course, I knew Batman, but I didn't know Blade Runner. So years later, probably actually not until my early 20s, did I finally catch up with it. And it was the director's cut, the
Hmm.
so-called director's cut. I mean, we could get into a little discussion about the cuts of this movie later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I saw it. I was kind of baffled by it, a bit bored by it. And yeah, I thought it was a bit of a letdown, but I did want to watch it again. And it would be a while till I watched it again, but I eventually did. And I watched it again after that and watched all the different cuts. And it sort of became this weird obsession where I was reading the book that it's based on by Philip K. Dick, which is called
Okay.
Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?
I wanted to
And
ask you about that. Yeah.
oh yeah, I read that, and I read a book about the making of this movie called Future Noir, which is about the size of a dictionary. And I just became so fascinated with it, and eventually it just became a movie that I love.
Okay, so you have much more like a wealth of knowledge then because I've actually never seen a theatrical cut ever.
That's not surprising at all because I feel like this theatrical cut is kind of difficult to track down.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm assuming my dad probably showed it to me on DVD, but then I bought a DVD thinking that was no, it is the director's cut, the one I have. So I saw that, and then I watched on HBO Max today because I was just lazy and didn't want to put my DVD in. But that was the final cut, and I
Mhm.
didn't really notice that much of a difference between my DVD and this one.
I'll go through the differences really quick.
Yeah, please, please.
Because they're actually pretty subtle. The theatrical cut, the biggest difference is it has this notorious Harrison Ford voiceover, and it has a kind of a tacked on happy ending. So if you see either of these things when you're watching Blade Runner, you know you're watching the theatrical cut. And the director's cut, which was released, I think, in the early 90s, it wasn't really a director's cut. Ridley Scott didn't really have much involvement. It was kind of just rushed out by Warner Brothers when they realized that there was a cult following for this movie.
Hmm.
And that's why they did the final cut. You know, Ridley Scott had a lot of involvement and he had certain demands, and that is the version that he truly endorses. And there's not a whole lot of changes between the director's cut and the theatrical cut. I mean, there are, but they're subtle.
So the voiceover is the biggest thing.
Mhm.
The other thing that I read too is that there's no unicorn shot. So like the
Y-
shot of him like at the piano.
Yes, the final cut, I believe, is the only shot with the unicorn.
Okay. So yeah, and then I looked online later because I was like, I want to see what the differences are too. And I guess, yeah, they drive away like into the sunset.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about the the reaction to this movie from critics and audiences when it came out, but they were having a lot of worries from the producers about this movie. So one of the demands was that they had to have a happy ending where Sean Young and Harrison Ford ride into the sunset together,
Hmm.
and they had to have this voiceover which helps kind of explain things because test audiences were just kind of baffled by it. The ending is especially ridiculous because you see this incredible post-apocalyptic world where LA is just dark and raining
Yeah.
and decrepit, and it's just this incredible vision. And then at the end, they're driving in this kind of beautiful wilderness, and
Mm.
it's like, well, what happened? I thought the world had gone to shit. You mean just outside of LA, like everything's fine? It really
Yeah.
just makes no sense.
You're like, why are you living there? But I don't know if you knew this. I saw this online today. Apparently, that
Mhm.
footage that they use of that nice scenery was stock footage or leftover footage from The Shining.
Oh, yes, indeed. I did know that. Yeah. Apparently, Stanley Kubrick shoots a lot of footage, and he was kind enough to let Ridley Scott borrow some. None of the actual footage from The Shining is in Blade Runner, but just
Right.
some extra stuff.
Yeah, I found that really interesting.
Mhm.
I almost, like, in a weird way, don't wanna see the theatrical cut because 'cause I'm like, I love the version that I've seen so much, and I've seen little glimpses of Harrison Ford's narration, and I'm like, like, I almost cringe when I hear it a little bit.
Oh yeah, it's really bad. I mean, I could see a voiceover working because this whole movie is very film noir, you know? And
Right,
one of the staples of film noir is being in the detective's head and hearing his thoughts, you know?
right.
So I could see that kind of working in this movie, but the problem was the dialogue wasn't written by either of the movie's writers,
Hmm,
and Ridley Scott wasn't even around to direct him. I think by this time he had just had it. So Harrison Ford was there with a guy he didn't know, didn't like, recording this dialogue that he didn't want to record.
huh.
And some people say he intentionally did a bad job, hoping that they wouldn't use it. But I think Harrison Ford has disputed that and said, you know, he's a professional; he would never do that. But yeah, the way it's delivered is almost like a parody of a detective movie.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't recommend the theatrical cut unless it's because you're curious, you know, which is why I went back to it recently. But my go-to is always the final cut.
Yeah, I mean, this was my first time actually seeing the final cut, and the subtle note the differences that I noticed were it's more violent. There is, Tyrell's eyes getting, like, crushed in by Roy. I was like, "Whoa, this I don't remember this being as intense."
Mhm.
And, what was it the other thing? When he stabs the nail through his hand. I don't
Oh yeah,
remember ever seeing that, and I was like, "Huh." So,
yeah.
I wanted to ask you what you thought about that because I've seen online that people say it's like a Jesus thing, or because you see his hand kind of do that thing a couple times in the movie where it like starts to clench. Is that like his body shutting down and he's trying to like feel feelings again? I don't know.
Yeah, that's kinda how I always interpreted it. It's, you know, he's coming to the end of his life, and,
Mm,
he it to me, I just felt like he's trying to wake himself up. Yeah, just, feel life again. It's really interesting, the replicants, you know, you're supposed to be able to spot them because they have, a lack of empathy. That's what the Voight-Kampff test is supposed to detect, but it's
mm.
funny, I feel like the replicants are more full of life in this movie than the humans are. I feel like the humans are they behave more like we'd imagine machines or androids would.
Yeah, I mean, and then I think the last shot where Harrison Ford's going to die, and then the replicant saves him, showing its humanity, and then
Mhm.
it allows itself to die too. You're just like, "Oh,
Yeah, probably the best scene in the movie.
yeah, that was really cool because it's almost like he's showing you, like, "I could have let you die."
Mhm,
And it reminded me of the line earlier when Harrison Ford talking about technology where he's just like, "It can be, like, used for good or bad,"
mhm.
basically, and in that moment, you get to see both, sort of, yeah, damn, this movie there's so much, like, philosophical discussion about something that's so kinda small in the grand scheme of things. It's not like the world's gonna end if these replicants keep going.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Rutger Hauer's death speech
Yeah.
is just it almost brings tears to my eyes. But
Yeah.
even a buddy of mine who has never seen this movie, he quotes that speech. I think it's probably one of the more famous moments in this movie. And
Mm.
Rutger Hauer actually wrote that. I don't know if he wrote the whole little speech, but I know he contributed quite a bit to it. And yeah, it's such a great moment.
Yeah, very passionately delivered. Yeah, I was looking up, the actors from this movie. Almost everyone is still alive except for him, actually.
Yeah, that's really too bad. I would have loved to have seen a way to to work him into the sequel.
I know, yeah, I was thinking if they were gonna do anything, maybe just, like, show a picture or something, but yeah,
Mhm.
no, they very self-contained. I'd like to go into the sequel later a little bit too
Oh,
if you're down.
definitely. Oh, I was just gonna say he's such a great villain, and I almost don't even think of him as a villain. Like
No.
you can watch this movie and almost think of him as the protagonist. I don't know. I mean, he obviously does some really bad things, but when you think about it, he's an escaped slave,
Yeah.
and he's helping other slaves to freedom. And Harrison Ford is the one that's killing them for profit.
Yeah, and seriously, I mean, he is like a retired cop, but you're right. He's like an anti-hero basically
Mhm,
because you do feel empathy for him. He shows you the empathy, and even in his killings, he's empathetic. When he kills
mhm,
Tyrell, and I think he said he calls him father and stuff like that. He feels bad when he does these things. So yeah, and you're right. He is only retaliating because he was looking for freedom. He was the
mhm.
one that was enslaved. He was built to be a slave, and then he escapes and retaliates. So I don't know. I mean, would anybody really do anything differently probably in his situation?
Yeah, and Pris, his female companion, I mean, she's essentially a sex slave
Yeah.
because earlier in the movie they talk about how she's a not a pleasure bot, but a pleasure model, something like that. They say something like that. So
Yeah.
I mean, the replicants are definitely very sympathetic in this movie, and I think that's part of the reason why audiences and critics might have had a difficult time with this movie because Harrison Ford coming off of at this point, Raiders of the Lost Ark and Empire Strikes Back,
Mhm.
he really isn't a very heroic character.
Yeah, I mean, he's very stoic, like,
Mhm,
very even more so for Harrison Ford. He always kind of is, but he has, like, no emotion in this movie, which, raises the question, is he a replicant? But
mhm.
everybody kinda acts like that in this movie. Nobody's too animated, ever.
Yeah, it's true, and the scene where, he kills I think her name is Zora, the other replicant, I mean, that's
I love
really
that.
brutal. I mean, he
Yeah.
just shoots her in the back and she's running away, she's an unarmed woman, and he
Right.
just kills her. That's pretty dark stuff for the hero of your movie.
Well, it's very they don't even really have a conversation about anything. He's just like, "Well, I got a job
Mhm,
to do. I know she's a replicant. I'm gonna kill her." I
mhm,
love that way that scene is shot. Just her running
mhm.
through the glass and the slow motion, the music. It looks real. My god, when she gets hit, like, it pumps through her chest. It's really well done.
A couple things to mention about the differences in the cuts
Mm,
that just sprung to mind. So this scene when Zora is killed, this scene they did use some digital technology to
mm,
polish some things. In the
okay.
theatrical cut, you can very obviously see it's a stunt woman wearing a pretty bad wig that's crashing through these windows, and they actually brought back the actress and reshot this not that
Nice.
many years ago, and it's amazing. You would never know it. You would think it was shot in 1982. So they
Ah,
did they did a really incredible job on that. And going back to a scene you mentioned earlier when Roy Batty's in Tyrell's office and he says in the version you saw, he says, "I've come for more life, father."
yeah.
In the theatrical cut, he says, "I've come for more life, fucker."
Huh.
So I actually prefer the final cut. I like him going to Tyrell not looking for a fight. He's
Mm.
there asking for mercy, and I like that better. It's more sympathetic.
Do you think that when he goes there, do you think he had the intention of killing him? If he were able to extend his life, do you think he would have ultimately killed Tyrell?
I don't think so. That's just the impression I get. I could
Yeah.
be wrong.
Well,
I
that
think
one
he
line changes everything. The father fucker line, it kinda does change his whole motive.
Yeah, yeah, and honestly, if you leave the line, "I want more life, fucker," maybe I do believe he wants to kill him. So it's interesting, but I don't know. I think he would have been too valuable to do away with, and maybe he did look at him like a father. You know?
Well, they also didn't they say that they have the same knowledge as their creators, right?
That sounds like a line. Yeah.
So I was thinking because it's almost like Roy when he comes in, he starts like, listing off all of these things you can do. Like, hey, we can do like protein suppression, or what if we did this EMS thing? They start like saying all these things, and Tyrell keeps shooting down all of his propositions. So
Hmm.
I'm thinking like, okay, Tyrell being a human might be able to like come up with different ideas that an android or replicant wouldn't be able to come up with. So that's why he's
Mm,
like, I've thought of these, and Tyrell is able to tell him why they won't work. And then
yeah.
finally, it's like the frustration of him knowing I'm a replicant, so I don't have the ability to come up with these ideas like a human might be able to, drives him to then kill his creator. I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. One interesting thing I learned an incredible documentary about this movie,
Which
which
one?
is it's called Dangerous Days, and it's I think available on most Blu-ray versions of this movie, and it's like 3 hours long. So it's very thorough. There was an idea that when Batty confronts Tyrell, that Tyrell is actually a replicant, and
Hmm.
that Tyrell died decades earlier. And I think you were going to discover that after he killed Tyrell. But the thing about these replicants is there's no difference between them and humans, at least that you can see on the surface. They bleed just like us. They're not like Terminators.
No.
So it would have been a hard thing to show that he was a replicant. So I think they abandoned that idea. And it's interesting that really you can't tell the difference between replicants and humans. It's a good choice, and I think if they like bled milk like the androids in
Mhm.
Alien,
Right.
you'd have less sympathy for them. For like when Zora's being shot and you see red blood, you realize like what's the difference? I guess that's the whole theme of the whole movie is what's the difference in the end. But
Mm.
I thought that was a good choice because it's different in the book, if I remember correctly. It's been a little while since I read the book, but I think they are more traditional robots.
Well, Pris's death is a good example of that because she dies so horrifically, her screeching and her just
Hmm.
like convulsing, and you're just like, ugh. And Harrison Ford just watching her, you're just like, yeah, this is basically a human. What makes her not a human?
Yeah.
And I guess that is kind of to go into a question I want to ask you. Do you think he's a replicant?
Oh, I knew that question was coming. And it's really cool that this movie has had this kind of question that fans have been asking each other for like 40 years now. I mean,
Yeah.
that's amazing. For me, no. And that's just how I take the movie. I feel like the movie doesn't work as well if he's a replicant. And it's funny, like I've seen interviews with Ridley Scott where he straight up says, "No, Deckard's a replicant."
Right.
And to me it doesn't really matter what anyone says, even the creator of the movie. It just matters how I experience it. Once an artist puts his art out there, it doesn't matter what he says, honestly. And I think, and I'm just speculating now, I think for one thing, Ridley Scott just loves that people are still talking about this.
Yeah.
And two, I think he might love contradicting Harrison Ford because Harrison Ford hates the idea of him being a replicant. And
Yeah.
from what I understand, those two didn't get along.
I've heard the same thing. They both completely contradict each other in interviews, so you're just kinda
Mhm.
like it's kinda funny, and then I've heard people being like, "Well, maybe Harrison Ford is so method that, like, he actually believes that he's not a replicant." It's just like, this is getting crazy.
Hey,
Yeah.
that's that's kind of a cool theory. I mean, I think one of the reasons that this movie has become such a cult classic is that there's a lot of ambiguity and, it doesn't spoon feed you information. Even the title itself, like the
Yes.
title itself, I think the original title was Dangerous Days, just like the documentary.
Hmm.
And then they changed it to Blade Runner. Blade Runner was just a title of another sci-fi novel that they had the rights to, and they just said, "I guess we'll call it that. It's a cool title." So it's like even the name of this movie is like something you could ponder. And
Yeah.
but I should ask, where do you fall on the whole Deckard replicant debate?
Dude, it's like I wanna believe he's not a replicant, but the thing is there's little moments that make me question it, like the little eye flash thing. Like, there's
Mhm.
little things. So, I don't think he is a replicant. I really do think he's a human, but that eye flash thing always gets me, and then also when, is it Graf? Edward James Olmos's character?
Yeah, I think that's right.
When he leaves that origami, unicorn, it's like, okay, so is that basically them confirming that that unicorn dream is implanted in his memory? So there's things that make me I'm just like, I can't know because they're 2 contradictory things.
I mean, the final cut makes it pretty decisive or pretty clear that he's a replicant, in my opinion. I
Mhm,
think that was important to Ridley Scott. If you take that unicorn dream that he has,
mhm,
and then you see that Gaff makes the unicorn origami, it implies that he is privy to Deckard's thoughts the way
mhm.
Deckard was privy to Rachel's thoughts. I mean, there's really no other explanation. But it's just funny, like, even though that information is in the movie, I just kind of refuse to accept it.
Yeah.
It's funny. When I watch this movie, I'm not really engrossed in the plot. I'm more just kind of along for the ride and
Yeah.
experiencing these amazing visuals. I don't it's hard to describe.
No, I totally
Um,
get it, dude. I totally
yeah,
get it.
it's
It's like 2001: A Space Odyssey, kind of. It's like you're in a mode where you get lost in time and, yeah, you're just along for the ride. The visuals are so impressive. The music's so, like, mesmerizing and hypnotic that it just either hooks you or it kinda doesn't sort of thing.
2001 is probably the perfect, comparison. That's yeah, that's spot on. Yeah, I mean, when I think about movies I really love, obviously plot is important and story and characters and all that stuff. You need all that stuff to make a great movie. But when I think about what really hooks me is like tone
Yeah.
and mood and atmosphere, and that's what I love so much about this movie and something like 2001 or The Shining or just so many movies that I love.
Yeah, this movie does such a great job of, like I mean, it takes place in Los Angeles, but it's raining the whole time. You're like, "Okay,
Mhm,
so that's just a little off."
mhm,
And there's so much neon, and there's so much, like there's Chinese or Mandarin, and there's Japanese, and there's English written everywhere, and a lot of people are speaking, like, a weird language, and so it's just, like, so much is just a little askew, but you're like, "I don't
mhm,
know." And then there's Coca-Cola, and Atari, and RCA, so you're like, "Okay, it's familiar things." So it's yeah, it just kinda makes you feel a little off. One thing before I forget, I just wanna mention, right at the end, another thing that made me question if he's a replicant or not is when Graf says, "You've done a man's job, sir."
mhm.
That line kind of messed me up a little bit too, because 'cause I'm
Oh,
like,
yeah.
is he saying that because he's not a man and congrats, you've done what a human could do? Or
Mhm.
yeah, I'm like, "God, what is this movie?"
Yeah, there's a lot of great little moments like that. Rachel says to him, "Have you ever done the test on yourself?"
Yeah.
And there's actually a deleted kind of extended scene in that awful happy ending that I mentioned earlier. I actually saw an extended version of that
Hmm.
where there is kind of this haunting little moment where Rachel says to him something like, "It's almost as if we were made for each other." And it's
Hmm.
just like this haunting little moment that even though I'm not big on that happy ending,
Yeah.
that does have this it just makes you think.
Yeah, damn. Well, before we move on to the sequel, 'cause I don't wanna talk about that, what does the book make you think if he's a replicant? Does it make you lean one way more than the other than the films, or what are your thoughts?
The book brings it up, but if I'm remembering correctly, and it has been a little while, it's pretty clear that he's not. The whole take on replicants, and they're not called replicants in the book, they're actually called androids.
Huh.
And he's not called a Blade Runner, he's just called a bounty hunter. It has a much less sympathetic view of replicants. You know, they're much more sinister. Philip K. Dick just had a different take on them. Yeah, they're almost the enemy.
Yeah.
So it plays out much differently. And I heard that Ridley Scott actually never even read the book. And
No way.
yeah, Philip K. Dick was very weary of Hollywood and letting Hollywood make movies out of his books, and he actually died just before Blade Runner came out, but he did see some footage, and he was actually really amazed by the footage. He did say something along the lines of he felt like the images were pulled right out of his head.
Wow.
He was a really interesting guy, and actually, some of my favorite sci-fi movies ever have been based on his work. I don't know if you know, but Total Recall was a adaptation of a
Oh,
Philip K. Dick book, as well as Minority Report. There's a lot of good ones.
no. I knew he did, Man in the High Castle. I didn't know those other 2 though. Huh.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I love the title. I think the title is such a cool, like, idea. Like, do what is it? Do androids dream of electric sheep?
Yeah,
That's so
absolutely.
cool.
Yeah, and I gotta say, a lot of that book and a lot of his stuff in general is way too deep for me. I would love to say how, he's my favorite author and this and that. Honestly, the book was a little bit of a chore for me, and towards the end, I felt like I didn't even know what was going on anymore. But actually, I felt I felt that way about this movie. So maybe check in with me in 10 years. Maybe it'll be my favorite book.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess the sequel,
Mhm.
maybe I mean, obviously not go as in depth as we have with Blade Runner, but I personally loved it. I thought it was such an amazing follow-up. I wish that it got more attention so that they could expand on it further, but I just off the top, I absolutely love that movie.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, how cool is it that it turned out as good as it did? I mean, 30 years later, or however long it's been, I was a little weary.
Mhm.
We've had a lot of sequels and reboots and to a lot of things that we grew up with. And, it's a mixed bag when you look back on a lot of stuff, but it absolutely blew me away. And I think it was made for the right reasons. Like, the original writer, Hampton Fancher, I think his name is, he came up with a great story, and he went to Ridley Scott, and they found a great director, Denis Villeneuve, and
Oh, yeah.
I'm almost surprised anyone would invest $200 million in a sequel to kind of a flop. At
Yeah.
least in 1982 it was, but I'm sure glad they did. Unfortunately, they didn't get a much of a return on their investment, but yeah, I loved it. It's one of my favorites of the decade.
Me too, man. I That's the thing that makes me so upset is like it's so good and I feel like it's just repeating the same thing as the original Blade Runner where like nobody really saw it when it came out. It was considered a
Mhm.
flop and then now as time goes on, people are like, "Yo, this was really good. How did I miss this? Why didn't I see this in theaters?" And it's like, "God damn it. If more people had seen this, we probably could have got because I don't think we're ever going to get to see what the hell happens with Deckard and his daughter now."
I know it. I think in live action, that might be it, but I don't know
Yeah.
if you know that there's a Blade Runner animated show, and
Yep.
literally the trailer was just released for it.
Yep, I watched it today. I'm
Mhm.
excited. I'm a little skeptical. When does it takes place in between Blade Runner 1 and 2, right?
Yes, there is a date that they gave, but it escapes
Yeah.
me.
And then there's also a bunch of different, like, they're on, YouTube, but there was a couple, like, short animated films and then some other shorts with, David Batista. Did you see those?
Yeah, and they're actually pretty cool.
Yeah.
Warner Brothers has done things like that before, where they release little shorts. They did it for Batman in between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and they did it between Matrix sequels, and
Huh.
it's kind of cool. I definitely think if you're a Blade Runner fan, those little short films are worth checking out. Two of them are live action, one of them is animated.
Yeah, and they're all pretty cool. They do give a nice little explanation about the gap in time in that world. But another
Mhm.
thing that maybe the book explains or I just totally missed it, the hell happened to this world?
That's actually something that the book does
Oh,
get into. And yeah, that was actually some of my favorite parts of the book. There was some sort of Third World War, World War Terminus, I think it was called. I think it was
okay.
between the US and Russia. This was a Cold War novel after all. And yeah, all the animals were killed. There's little references to that in the movie when he
Yeah.
asks, is that a real owl? And she's like, of course not. And actually, Rick's whole motive for taking on this mission, I think, is to buy a sheep because if you can get a real animal, it's like a huge status symbol. The book
Mm.
is so weird.
Well, I mean, if all animals are dead, because yeah, the owl, the snake, they even asked the question, it's like if you were given it, was it a rabbit? And it was like, I would report it to the authorities. So there are
Mhm,
little weird things like that. And then boiled dog, they talk about a bunch
mhm.
of weird things. Yeah, man, this, God, it's such a good movie. And especially for the time, everybody always talks about 82 as like Tron, like, oh, Tron had the best special effects. It really blew me away. Dude, Blade Runner special effects are like out of control how good they are for 82.
Oh, absolutely. So I saw the Tyrell Pyramid in real life. It's at
Really?
Yeah, it's at the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, and the thing's massive. I mean, it's a miniature, but it's probably as tall as I am.
Whoa.
And when you see this thing and the detail and the little light bulbs and I mean, you can't tell me that something with filmmaking craft has been lost these past few years. Like
Yeah.
when you see how these things used to be made, it's just incredible.
Yeah, dude, it holds up so well. I don't know if they did any, like, enhancements to the, Final Cut, maybe that my DVD doesn't have, but I'm watching it, like, there is nothing here that doesn't look seamless. There's not, like, anything, "Ah, it's a little janky." Like, everything looks really good. I don't
I
know.
think they did. I think they did polish up the final cut a little bit, but nothing major. Nothing like they did to the Star Wars movies.
Right.
And honestly, I think it's one of the most beautiful movies ever made.
Yeah, man, and the score, I mean, Vangelis, I've never heard him
Mm,
do anything else, but, like, I find myself I have some of his this soundtrack or the score even on my, iPod, and whenever
mm.
it comes on, I never change it. I'm always just like, "Here we go," and it starts off just like, "Enhance 44 to 55," and then all of a sudden the score starts coming in, I'm like, "Oh, yes, I love this."
Yep. Yeah. It's funny. I looked him up too because I don't really know much by him, and
No.
you think he would have been one of those composers that it was just like, oh, hit after hit after hit. But no, this is one of the few things I know by him. But it's incredible. It just sucks you into that world.
Yeah. Darn, I'm sure I'm gonna forget something later, but is there any last minute thoughts you have on Blade Runner?
Well, I actually did get to see this theatrically.
Mm.
A couple of years ago, and it was in a kind of a small art house theater, but it was sold out show,
Oh,
and it
yeah.
was the final cut, beautiful projection. And it's funny, I would say maybe a half dozen couples got up and left before the credits.
What?
Yeah, no, it's funny. Like this movie is still kind of polarizing. Either you get it or you don't. And sometimes, like in my case or your case too, it takes a while to get there. But yeah, it's not for everybody. But man, it's great.
I wonder if I'm a little bit biased towards it because of how much I like Harrison Ford. I'm trying to
Mhm.
imagine if it was like Kurt Russell, like would I have the same feeling about it?
I think if you do Kurt Russell, you're kind of in the same boat. Like you have certain expectations. One actor who did consider this role was actually Dustin Hoffman.
Hmm.
And I think if it was an actor like that, it would have adjusted the audience's expectations to not expect something like Star Wars or Indiana Jones to go in, maybe this is going to be something a little darker, a little grittier, a little more like Chinatown,
Yeah.
or if you had an actor like Jack Nicholson, I think it would have helped with expectations. I think that was the problem in 1982.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think you said it earlier too. It's just Harrison Ford. You're right. There was an expectation, and this was right after his whole career started to explode. And it's funny you mentioned Chinatown. I was thinking, I was like, Chinatown is like the '70s version of this. Then there's obviously Blade Runner in the '80s. And then I was thinking, I was
Mhm.
like, Fifth Element's kind of like the '90s version of those movies, a little bit.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And oh man, when you watch this movie, you just think of so many movies that have taken inspiration from this. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
as much as I love Batman movies, I don't think any Gotham City looks more impressive than LA in this movie. You know, I love a lot of the production design in the Batman movies. And I think Christopher Nolan actually screened this movie for his crew before they started Batman Begins.
Hmm. Well, Joe, I learned so much, and it's good to talk to somebody that I feel like you love this movie even more than I do. It's fun to talk about. I don't know, something I'm passionate about too.
Absolutely, man. It was a good time. Man, I think maybe we got to do the sequel. I think we got to give it
Uh-huh.
its due sometime.
Absolutely. And I don't think Eric's seen it, so I'm gonna be like, dude, sit down, rewatch the original one, then rewatch the sequel, then we'll get Joe on here and we're gonna have like, we'll talk more about the sequel, but we'll bring obviously elements back in. But yes, dude, 100%.
Cool, man. Anytime.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening in. And tomorrow we're going to be launching a new little sub-series here on the Wheel of Horror, so watch out for that. And on Monday, we'll be doing Cabin Fever for regular horror episodes. And next Thursday for Sci-Fi Summer, we'll be doing Alien. So, busy week.